Kira Vasquez had been at the Galactic Integration Academy for 6 standard weeks, and in that time she had spoken exactly 14 words. The other students watched her with a mix of curiosity and fear whenever she walked through the curved hallways of the space station. The Villani students with their beautiful gossamer wings would flutter nervously when she passed by. The crystalline Thariki, who made soft chiming sounds when they moved, would go completely silent. The graceful 4-armed Cassari would step aside and press themselves against the walls. She sat at the back of Xenobiology 204 every single day. Her desk was different from all the others because it had been specially built to handle Earth standard gravity tolerance. It was made of reinforced metal alloy and weighed nearly 20 kilograms. The other students had desks made of light organic materials that weighed almost nothing. Her dark hair fell over her face like a curtain, and she kept her eyes down most of the time. She had learned very quickly that looking directly at the other species made them uncomfortable. Her eyes faced forward like all human eyes did, and that was the mark of a predator species. The other students had eyes on the sides of their heads like prey animals, and they found her gaze deeply unsettling. Professor Yeneth was a Villani whose iridescent wings would shake with barely hidden nervousness whenever he had to speak to Kira directly. He had learned not to call on her in class after the first time he tried. She had answered his question in her normal voice, and 3 Thoreki students had cracked along their stress fractures from the deep sound vibrations. Human voices were simply too low and too powerful. For their delicate crystalline bodies, the whispers followed her everywhere. She went in the station. Deathworlder. They called her Class 12 planet, they said. Toxic. Atmosphere predator species. Kira heard all of it, and she pretended not to. Notice the Galactic Integration Academy was supposed to be a place where young beings from across the galaxy could learn together and build bridges between their species. There were students from over 40 different worlds, and Kira was the only human. She was part of a new exchange program that her father had pushed her to join. You will be an ambassador, he had told her before she left Earth. You will show them that we are not monsters. But every time she moved too quickly, the other students flinched away from her. Every time she spoke, they winced at the sound. Every time her heart beat in her chest, they could hear it because their hearing was so much more sensitive than hers. Her heartbeat was loud and slow and raw compared to their rapid fluttering pulses, so Kira made herself small. She made herself quiet. She tried to take up as little space as possible. One day during the 3rd week, a young Cassari female named Mira Telvan had tried to talk to her. Mira had approached Kira during the midday rest cycle when most students were eating or socializing in the common areas. She had extended all 4 of her hands in the traditional Cassari gesture of peaceful greeting. I am Mira, she had said in her soft musical voice. Your planet is called Earth, yes. I have read about it in my studies. The trees there grow so very tall. Kira had looked up from her tablet, and her eyes had fixed on Mira with an intensity that made the Cassari girl freeze. Mira had 2 hearts, and both of them had stuttered in that moment under the weight of that predator. Gaze, yeah, Kira had said after a long pause. They do. Then she had looked back down at her tablet, and Mira had slowly backed away. The Cassari girl was not sure if she had been threatened or simply dismissed, but either way, she did not try to talk to the human again. What none of the other students knew was that Kira had not wanted to come to the academy at all. This had been her father's dream, not hers. He worked for the Earth Diplomatic Corps, and he believed that humans needed to prove themselves to the galactic community. He believed that sending young humans to study alongside alien species would help break down the barriers of fear and mistrust. But Kira had known from the moment she arrived that it would not be that simple on Earth. She had been captain of her school's combat athletics team. She could run 5 kilometers without stopping to catch her breath. She could lift weights that would crush most of the students here. Her bones were dense and strong because Earth's gravity was so much heavier than what most species experienced. Her immune system was so aggressive that she could survive diseases that would kill a Vellani in hours. Her body could heal from wounds that would be fatal to the delicate thoraciche. It was built for survival on a world that was constantly trying to kill her, and everyone here knew it. The teachers were always careful around her. The other students gave her a wide berth in the hallways. Even the station's security officers watched her with wary eyes whenever she passed there. Checkpoints. Kira understood why they were afraid. She had read the same xenobiology texts that they studied in class. She knew what a Class 12 planet meant in galactic terms. Earth was classified as a death world because of its extreme gravity and toxic oxygen atmosphere and violent weather patterns, and the incredible diversity of predator species that lived there. Any being that could survive and thrive on such a world was considered inherently dangerous. Humans were apex predators. That was simply a biological fact, but Kira did not feel like an apex predator. She felt lonely and tired and very far from home. She missed her family and her friends and the feeling of real sunlight on her skin. She missed being able to laugh loudly without worrying about hurting someone's ears. She missed being able to run without causing a panic, so she stayed quiet in class. She kept her head down. She answered questions in the softest voice she could manage, and she tried very hard not to make any sudden movements. She told herself that eventually they would see that she was not dangerous. Eventually, they would realize that she was just a girl who wanted to learn and make friends like everyone else, but 6 weeks had passed and nothing had changed. Other students still whispered about her when they thought she could not hear. They still flinched when she walked by. They still looked at her with fear in their eyes. And Kira was beginning to wonder if her father had been wrong. Maybe humans would always be monsters in the eyes of the galaxy. Maybe no amount of quiet good behavior could erase millions of years of predator evolution. Maybe she would spend her entire time at the academy alone and isolated and feared. She did not know that everything was about to change. She did not know that in just a few hours an alarm would sound and raiders would breach the station walls, and she would discover what she was truly capable of. She did not know that her classmates were about to see her not as a monster, but as something else entirely. For now Kira Vasquez just sat at her reinforced desk in the back of Xenobiology 204, and she stayed quiet and she waited for the class to end so she could return to her quarters and be alone. That was all she knew how to do anymore. The sound that tore through the academy was unlike anything Kira had ever heard before. It was a strange oscillating wail that seemed to hit multiple frequencies at the same time. The alarm had been designed to be heard by dozens of different species with dozens of different types of hearing, and the result was a noise that made Kira's teeth ache and her skull vibrate around her. The classroom erupted into immediate chaos. The Vellani students froze in place with their wings locked tight against their backs. This was their species' automatic response to danger, and they could not control it any more than Kira could control her own heartbeat. The Thoreki students began to crack as stress fractures spread across their crystalline bodies. The Cassari students scrambled toward the emergency exits with all 4 of their arms, pushing and grabbing at anything in their path. Professor Yeneth stood at the front of the room, and his wings had stopped moving completely. His face had gone pale, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Krethvari, he said. The Krethvari have breached the station. Kira did not know that name, but she understood the terror in his voice immediately. Whatever the Krethvari were, they were bad enough to make a teacher lose all composure in front of his students. Everyone remain calm, Professor Yeneth tried to say, but his voice cracked and broke. Security protocols are being activated, and we should all stay in place until he never finished his sentence. The far wall of the classroom exploded inward with a tremendous crash. Kira was moving before she even realized what she was doing. Her body reacted on pure instinct, and she was out of her seat and across the room in less than a second. She grabbed two Vellani students who were frozen in place, and she shoved them behind her as gently as she could. Then she positioned herself between the breach in the wall and the rest of the class. Debris rained down all around them. There were chunks of the organic station hull and shards of something that might have been bone or metal or some combination of both. Smoke and dust filled the air and made it hard to see. Then through the smoke, they came. The Krethvari were nightmares given physical form. They were insectoid creatures with many limbs and hard black carapaces that gleamed in the emergency lighting. Their heads were dominated by massive compound eyes that reflected everything around them in fractured images. Their mandibles were huge and sharp, and they dripped with something that hissed and bubbled when it hit the floor. There were 6 of them, and they moved in perfect synchronization, like they were all controlled by a single mind. Their compound eyes swept across the room and took in every cowering student, and the terrified Professor Kira counted them and measured their size and noted the weapons they carried. They were big, but not as big as she had first thought, maybe 2 meters tall at most. They were fast, but she had seen them move, and she thought she might be faster in short bursts. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but it was not pounding with fear. It was pounding with something older and deeper, something that her ancestors had carried with them across African savannas and through ice ages and across oceans and finally up into the stars. Her muscles tensed and her vision sharpened, and every nerve in her body was screaming the same message: threat detected, protect the pack, fight. The lead Krethvari stepped forward and clicked its mandibles together in a sound that made several students whimper. When it spoke, its voice was harsh and broken, and it used a crude version of Galactic Standard Soft ones. It said, "Prey ones, you will come with us. You will feed the swarm." Professor Yeneth made a sound like breaking glass. "Please," he begged. "Please, we are a school. These are children. They are not threats to anyone." The creature's head swiveled toward him, and its compound eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "Children grow," the Krethvari said. "Children become threats. Better to harvest them while they are young and tender." Several students started crying. The Thereki were cracking so badly that pieces of their crystalline bodies were falling to the floor. The Vellani were still frozen and unable to move at all. The Kassari were huddled together near the blocked exits with all of their arms wrapped around each other. The lead Krethvari took another step forward and raised one of its bladed limbs, and Kira Vasquez spoke her 15th word at the Galactic Integration Academy. No, the sound of her voice cut through the chaos like a knife. It was not loud exactly, but it carried a weight and a power that made everyone in the room stop and turn toward her. The Krethvari paused, its compound eyes fixed on her, and for a moment it seemed confused by what it was seeing. Here was a small creature with soft skin, and no claws and no armor and no obvious weapons. Here was something that looked like easy prey. But this small soft creature was not running, and it was not freezing, and it was not begging. It was standing in front of the other students, with its feet planted and its hands clenched into fists, and its forward-facing predator eyes locked directly onto the Krethvaris. "Face you, speak soft one," the creature asked. "You challenged the swarm." Kira's hands found the edge of her desk, the reinforced alloy desk that had been built to withstand Earth-standard gravity. 20 kilograms of solid metal that she had been sitting at every day for 6 weeks. She gripped it and she lifted it, and it rose from the floor like it weighed nothing. It Ali said. "No," Kira told the Krethvari, and her voice was calm and steady and absolutely certain. "You are not taking anyone from this room." The lead Krethvari made a clicking sound that might have been laughter. "One soft creature thinks it can stop the swarm. This will be amusing," It raised its bladed limbs and prepared to strike, and Kira Vasquez prepared to show them exactly what a Deathworlder could do. The desk came apart in her hands. Kira did not mean to break it, or maybe she did. Later, she would not be able to remember exactly what she had been thinking in that moment. All she knew was that 1 second, she was holding the reinforced metal desk, and the next second she had torn it along its welded seam like it was made of paper now. She was holding 2 pieces of jagged metal, each one about half a meter long and heavy enough to do serious damage. The lead Krethvari barely had time to react. Humans were classified as pursuit predators in the galactic databases. They had evolved to chase prey across endless distances and to outlast rather than outrun. But what the databases often failed to mention was that humans could also sprint. For short distances, a human could accelerate faster than almost any other species. In the known galaxy, Kira crossed the classroom. In less than a second, the first piece of metal took the lead, Krethvari in what might have been its throat. The jagged edge punched through the gap between its armored plates and sank deep into the soft tissue beneath. The creature made a wet clicking sound, and green ichor sprayed from the wound, and then it collapsed to the floor. Kira did not stop to watch it fall. She was already moving to the next target, and her improvised weapon was already swinging through the air. The second Krethvari tried to raise its bladed limbs to defend itself, but it was too slow. The metal caught it across the side of its head, and the impact sent it spinning into the wall. 3 of the remaining 4 raiders rushed toward her at the same time. Kira ducked under the first attack and felt the blade pass so close to her head that it cut a few strands of her hair. She drove her elbow into the creature's midsection and heard something crack inside its carapace. Then she spun and brought her weapon down on the second attacker's leg joint, and a limb bent in a direction it was never meant to go. The third one managed to slash her across the arm. The pain was sharp and immediate, and Kira felt her own blood start to run down toward her hand. But the pain did not stop her. It barely even slowed her down. She had been hurt worse than this in combat athletics training back on Earth, and she had learned a long time ago how to keep fighting through injury. She used the moment of the made creature's surprise to drive her improvised weapon through its carapace. The Krethvari made a horrible screeching sound as it died behind her. Kira could hear her classmates making sounds of shock and fear. She could hear Professor Yeneth calling out something, but she could not make out the words. All of her focus was on the 2 remaining raiders and on keeping herself between them and the students. "It bleeds," one of the Krethvari hissed to the other. "Look at it. It bleeds red, and it does not stop fighting." "What is this creature?" the other one demanded. "What kind of soft one fights like this?" From somewhere behind Kira, she heard Mira Telvan's voice. It was high and trembling, but the words were clear. "She's his human. She is from Earth. She is a Deathworlder." Word rippled through the remaining raiders like a physical force. Deathworlder schools. 12 planetae worlds so hostile and violent and dangerous that any species emerging from it was classified as an existential threat to the rest of the galaxy. And this Deathworlder was just a child, just a student, just a young female who had been sitting quietly in the back of a classroom until a few minutes ago. If this was what their children could do, then what were their adults capable of? The last 2 Krethvari looked at each other, and some kind of communication passed between them through whatever hive mind link they shared. Then one of them made a decision at random. The other one followed a moment later, and they fled through the breach in the wall, clicking and shrieking in their own language. Kira heard their footsteps echoing through the corridors as they retreated, and she heard answering calls from other raiders elsewhere in the station. She stood in the center of the ruined classroom and breathed Hard her arm was bleeding badly, and she was covered in green Krethvari ichor, and her hands were still gripping the twisted pieces of metal that had once been her desk. Her heart was pounding so hard that she could feel it in her ears, and her whole body was shaking with leftover adrenaline around her. The classroom was silent. 4 Krethvari bodies lay on the floor. The walls were splattered with green blood, and there were gouges in the floor where bladed limbs had struck during the fight. The emergency lights flickered and cast strange shadows across everything. Kira turned around. Slowly 23 faces stared back at her. Vellani were still frozen in place with their wings pressed tight against their backs. The Thereki were cracked and damaged but still alive. The Cassari were huddled together with expressions of pure shock on their faces. Professor Yeneth stood at the front of the room with his mouth open and no sound coming out. They were all looking at her. They were all looking at her the same way they had always looked at her, with fear and horror and the absolute certainty that she was a monster. Kira felt something break inside her chest. She had tried so hard. She had been so quiet and so careful and so small. She had done everything she could to make them see that she was not dangerous, and now they had seen the truth. Now they knew what she really was. The pieces of metal slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed against the nearest wall and slid down until she was sitting on the ground. The shaking got worse, and she wrapped her arms around herself and tried to hold herself together. She had saved them. She knew that. She had protected them from the raiders, and she had driven off the threat, and none of her classmates had been taken or killed, but all she could see was the horror in their eyes. All she could feel was the weight of being a monster in a room full of prey. The adrenaline faded and the shock set in, and Kira Vasquez sat alone in the ruins of the classroom and waited for someone to tell her what happened next. She did not know what to do anymore. She did not know if there was anything she could do. She had shown them what she was, and there was no way to take it back. The station's security forces arrived 12 minutes after the fight ended. They came through the corridors in full tactical gear, with weapons raised and scanners sweeping for any remaining threats. They found the classroom in ruins with 4 Krethvari corpses cooling on the floor and a human girl sitting against the wall with her arms wrapped around her knees. The students and Professor Yeneth had already been evacuated by emergency medical teams. They had been rushed to medical bays and trauma counselors in safe rooms throughout the station. Kira had refused to move when they tried to take her with them. The security chief was a massive Gorthi with scales like hammered bronze and arms as thick as tree trunks. He approached the human carefully with his weapon lowered but ready. Miss Vasquez, he said in a deep rumbling voice, you need to come with us for medical attention and debriefing. Kira did not look up at him. She did not respond at all. She just sat there shaking with her eyes fixed on the floor. The Gorvathi tried to step closer, and Kira flinched so violently that he immediately backed away. He had seen combat veterans react like this before. The human girl was in shock, and pushing her right now would only make things worse. He activated his communicator. The human is unresponsive, he reported. Possible combat dissociation. Recommend sedation and physical restraint for transport negative. A new voice cut through the chaos of the ruined classroom. It was calm and authoritative, and it carried the weight of someone who was used to being a Bait Academy director. Vashani stepped through the breach in the wall and surveyed the scene with all 4 of her ancient eyes. She was an old Kasari, and her forearms bore the ceremonial scars of a peacekeeper from the last Great War. She had seen more violence in her lifetime than most beings could imagine. Everyone out, she commanded. Clear this room now, but directive the security chief began now. The room emptied in seconds. Even the Gorvathi security chief did not argue with that tone. Soon it was just Director Vashani and Kira alone among the bodies and the debris. Old Kasari moved slowly and deliberately across the room. She lowered herself to the floor with care until she was sitting at Kira's level. She did not try to touch the girl or crowd her space. She simply sat nearby and waited. Child, she said softly. Kira did not respond. Kira Vasquez. Look at me slowly. The human raised her head. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her face was streaked with tears that had carved channels through the drying blood. Green ichor and red human blood mixed together on her skin and her clothes. I killed them, Kira whispered. Her voice was hoarse and broken. I killed them all. You did, Director Vashani agreed. There was no judgment in her voice, just simple acknowledgement of fact. He did not mean to. I could not stop. I saw them coming for the others, and something inside me just took over, and I could not control it. Her breath hitched and more tears spilled down her cheeks. I am a monster. That is what they all think. That is what they have always thought, and they were right. Director Vashani was quiet for a long moment. She watched the human girl with eyes that had seen countless young beings struggle with violence and trauma and identity. Do you know why the Krethvari raid schools? She asked finally. Kira shook her head. She did not know anything about the Krethvari, except that they had tried to take her classmates because schools are soft targets, the director explained. Students are young and sheltered, and they have not been trained to fight back. Teachers are scholars, not warriors. Schools have minimal security because no one expects them to be attacked. The Krethvari know this. They have been raiding educational facilities across this sector for over 300 years. Kira listened, but she did not understand what this had to do with her. All that time, Director Vashani continued. In 300 years of Krethvari raids, there has never been a successful defense of a school. Not once. Students and teachers have always been taken. Facilities have always been destroyed. No one has ever managed to fight back and win. She paused and let that sink in until today. Kira's head came up and she stared at the old Cassari with confusion in her eyes. I scared them, she said. My classmates, when they looked at me after the fight, I saw it in their faces. They were terrified of me. Director Vashani shook her head slowly. I spoke with young Mira Telvin before I came here. Do you know what she told me? Kira waited. She told me that when the raiders came through the wall, she was frozen in place. Her body would not move and her mind would not work, and she was certain that she was going to die. Then she saw you step in front of her. She saw you put yourself between the danger and the rest of the class. She saw you get hurt and keep fighting. She saw you refuse to let them take anyone. The director's 4 eyes bore into Kira's too. She told me that the human protected us. Those were her exact words. She said you were hurt and bleeding, and you still would not stop protecting us. That is not what monsters do. Kira Vasquez. Kira felt something shift inside her chest. A tiny crack in the wall of shame and self-hatred that had been building since the fight ended. Then, what she started to ask, but her voice failed her. That is what guardians do. The word hung in the air between them. Guardian, it was such a different word than monster. It meant something completely different. Somewhere in the distance, emergency klaxons were still wailing. The station was on high alert, as security teams were still hunting the raiders who had escaped. But in this ruined classroom, none of that seemed to matter. They will still be afraid of me, Kira said, but there was less certainty in her voice. Now perhaps, Director Vashani admitted. Fear is not easily unlearned. Your classmates have spent their whole lives being taught that Deathworlders are dangerous. One day will not erase all of that conditioning. She reached out slowly and rested one weathered hand on Kira's shoulder. But fear and respect often walk the same path. And I think that after today, your classmates will begin to understand the difference between a predator that hunts and a predator that protects. Kira looked down at her bloody hands, at the green and red mixed together on her skin. What do I do now? She asked. Director Vashani rose to her feet and extended a hand to help. Kira, up now. You let the medical team look at that arm. Now you rest and recover and give yourself time to process what happened here. And when you are ready, you go back to class and you show them who you really are. She paused, and a small smile crossed her ancient face. The Question is not whether they fear you, Kira Vasquez. The question is what you choose to do with that fear. Kira took the offered hand and let the director pull her to her feet. Her legs were shaky and her arm was throbbing, and she was exhausted in a way she had never experienced before. But somewhere deep inside her something had changed. Was not sure yet what she was going to do. She was not sure how her classmates would react when they saw her again. She was not sure if she could ever go back to being the quiet girl in the back of the room, but for the first time since the fight ended, she did not feel like a monster. She felt like something else entirely. She felt like maybe there was a place for her here after all. 3 days passed before Kira returned to class. The classroom had been completely rebuilt in that time. New walls had been grown from the station's organic hull material. New desks had been fabricated and arranged in neat rows. New floor panels had been installed to replace the ones that had been damaged in the fight. Everything looked clean and fresh and new, but nothing could erase what had happened there. Kira stood in the doorway for a long moment before she made herself walk inside. Her arm was wrapped in a medical bandage, and she moved with a slight limp from a muscle strain she had not even noticed during the fight. Human healing was fast, but 3 days was not enough to fix everything. The students were already in their seats when she arrived. They watched her walk through the door, and their eyes tracked her movement across the room with the same wary attention they had always shown. Kira felt her heart sink. Nothing had changed. They still looked at her like she was something dangerous. They still watched her like prey animals watching a predator. She walked to her seat at the back of the room. Her reinforced desk had not been replaced yet because the fabrication unit was still working on a new one. There was just a standard desk there, now made of light organic materials, like everyone else had. Kira sat down very carefully because she was afraid of breaking the delicate furniture. She kept her eyes down and her hands in her lap, and she waited for class to begin. The silence in the room was heavy and uncomfortable. Then someone stood up. Kira looked up and saw Myra Talvan rising from her seat near the front of the room. The young Cassari's 4 hands were trembling, but she had a determined look on her face. She walked down the aisle between the desks until she reached Kira's row. "Is this seat taken?" she asked. Kira stared at her in confusion. "What, this seat?" Myra pointed to the empty desk beside Kira. "Is it taken? I thought I might sit here today, if you do not mind. I thought maybe I could sit near you." Before Kira could figure out how to respond, another student stood up. It was one of the Thareki who had cracked badly during the raid. New crystalline growth was visible where the damage had been repaired, but the student moved without any sign of pain. "I would also like to sit nearby," the Thareki said. "If that is acceptable to you, Kira Vasquez." Then a Valani student rose from her seat. Her gossamer wings fluttered nervously, but she walked toward the back of the room anyway. Then 2 more Cassaries stood up together. Then 3 more Thareki, moving as a group. One by one the students rearranged themselves. They did not crowd around Kira exactly because they were still too cautious for that. But they moved their desks closer to hers. They positioned themselves near her. They put themselves within her reach, within her protection. Kira felt tears prick at her eyes, and she had to blink hard to keep them from falling. She did not understand what was happening. She had been so sure that they would hate her now. She had been so sure that showing them what she was would drive them away forever. Professor Yeneth watched from the front of the room as his entire seating chart reorganized itself. His wings quivered with an emotion that Kira could not read, but he did not try to stop what was happening. He just waited until everyone had settled into their new positions. Well, he said, when the movement finally stopped, "It seems our seating arrangement has evolved somewhat." He paused, and something that might have been a smile crossed his alien features. "Shall we begin today's lesson? We are covering the defensive adaptations of species from Class 8 through Class 12 planets." He caught himself before he could finish the thought, but then he seemed to change his mind. "Miss Vasquez," he said, Would you perhaps be willing to provide some first-hand examples for the class? Your perspective would be most valuable. Every face in the room turned toward Kira. For 6 weeks she had kept quiet. For 6 weeks she had hidden her voice and made herself small and tried to pretend that she was not what she was. For 6 weeks she had been afraid of scaring them, but they were not looking at her with fear anymore. They were looking at her with curiosity and interest in something else that took her a moment to recognize trust. Kira stood up slowly, and she did not try to make herself smaller this time. She let herself take up space. She let herself be seen. "I can do that," she said, and her voice was not soft or careful. It was her real voice, the voice she had been hiding since she arrived. She walked to the front of the room and turned to face her classmates. 23 faces looked back at her, and not one of them flinched, so she began. Humans evolved on a planet where basically everything was trying to kill us. The weather was trying to kill us with hurricanes and tornadoes and blizzards. The animals were trying to kill us with teeth and claws and venom. The plants were trying to kill us with poison and thorns. Sometimes, even the ground itself was trying to kill us with earthquakes and volcanoes. She paused, and a small smile crossed her face, and instead of dying out, we got stubborn about it. We decided that if the planet wanted to kill us, we were just going to have to get better at not dying. So we developed endurance running to chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. We developed sweating to regulate our body temperature in ways that most species cannot. We developed dense bones and strong muscles to handle heavy gravity. We developed aggressive immune systems to fight off diseases. The students were leaning forward in their seats now. They were fascinated. We also did some really weird things, Kira continued. We started eating plants that were trying to poison us because we liked the way they tasted. We call them spices. We domesticated wolves and turned them into pets that live in our homes and sleep in our beds. We invented something called caffeine addiction, where we drink a mild poison every morning because it makes us feel more awake. A Kasari student raised one of her hands. You voluntarily poison yourselves every morning. Pretty much, yeah, Kira admitted. It is called coffee, and most humans cannot function without it. The class erupted in questions after that. They wanted to know about Earth's weather and Earth's animals and Earth's strange customs. They wanted to know how humans survived and what they ate and how they raised their children. They wanted to know everything. Kira answered as many questions as she could, and when she did not know the answer, she said so. She talked about her home and her family, and the life she had left behind to come to the academy. She talked about being scared when she first arrived and feeling alone and wishing she could just fit in. She did not try to hide what she was anymore. She was a Deathworlder. She was a human from a Class 12 planet. She was built for survival and struggle, and she carried millions of years of predator evolution in her DNA. But she was also a 17-year-old girl who missed her family and wanted to make friends. She was a student who wanted to learn. She was a person who had been lonely and scared, and who had found her courage when it mattered most. When the class ended, Mira Telvan walked beside Kira as they left the room. "Thank you," the Kasari girl said quietly, "for what you did during the raid." "I never got to say that before," Kira shrugged. "I did not really think about it. I just reacted. That is what makes it special," Myra said. "You did not think about whether to help us. You just did it. That is what a guardian does." There was that word again, guardian. Director Vashani had used it, and now Myra was using it, and Kira was starting to think that maybe it fit. She still did not belong perfectly. She probably never would. She was too strong and too loud and too intense for the delicate species around her. She would always have to be careful not to break things or hurt people by accident. But she had a place here now. She was the Deathworlder in a school full of soft things. She was the predator among prey. She was the dangerous one that everyone used to fear. And now she was also the protector, the guardian. The one who would stand between her friends and anything that tried to hurt them in a galaxy full of gentle beings and fragile beauty. There was room for someone built from sterner stuff. There was need for someone who could face the darkness and not flinch. There was a place for someone who would never ever stop protecting her pack. Kira Vasquez walked through the curved hallways of the Galactic Integration Academy, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she did not try to make herself small. She had found where she belonged.